Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket. It's time to let go and drift into the story. Teachers never really get weekends off, and that Saturday in October 2023 was no exception. I was hunched over my kitchen table with a mountain of third-grade math tests, my red pen working overtime on problems about apples and oranges that somehow never added up right. At 33, I'd settled into this routine pretty well. Grade papers, prep lessons, repeat. The house was mine. A small 2-bedroom place in a quiet neighborhood just outside Portland that I'd bought 3 years earlier with my teachers, salary and a decent down payment from my parents. My coffee had gone stone cold hours ago, and I was still wearing that ratty oversized sweater with the hole in the left elbow. The one I refused to throw away despite my sister's constant complaints. The October light was already starting to fade through my kitchen window, painting everything in that golden autumn glow that made me actually love living in Oregon. Complete silence except for the scratch of my pen and the occasional car passing by outside. The knock at my front door came out of nowhere, sharp and official, 3 deliberate raps that made me jump and accidentally draw a line straight through little Tommy's addition problem. I glanced at the clock on my microwave, 4:47 p.m. Nobody ever came by unannounced, especially not on weekends. My neighbors were the type who kept to themselves, and my family always called first. I set down my pen and walked toward the front door, wondering if maybe it was a delivery I'd forgotten about. The knocking came again. Same pattern, same intensity. When I peered through the peephole, I saw a man in his 40s standing on my porch, wearing a dark jacket and jeans. He had short brown hair and was holding something small and rectangular in his hand. Nothing about him screamed official, but there was something about his posture that made me hesitate before opening the door. "Ma'am, I'm Officer Johnson with the County Sheriff's Department," heckled out, his voice carrying that practiced authority that cops have. He held up what appeared to be a badge, though from my angle through the peephole, I couldn't make out the details clearly. "I'm here to conduct a wellness check. We received a call about this address." I unlocked the deadbolt, but kept the chain latch engaged, opening the door just enough to speak through the gap. The man was average height, maybe 5'8", with tired eyes and the slight stubble that suggested he'd been working all day. His jacket was black, not the typical uniform I'd expect from a sheriff's deputy, and his jeans were faded in a way that seemed too casual for official business. "A wellness check?" I asked, genuinely confused. "I'm sorry, but I think there's been some mistake. I'm fine. Nobody called about me." He shifted his weight from one foot to the other, and I noticed he kept glancing past me into my house. "Well, that's what we need to verify, Miss Catherine," he said, and my stomach lurched. I hadn't told him my name. The way he said it was too familiar, too comfortable, like he'd been practicing it. Sometimes people don't realize when others are concerned about them. "May I come in for just a few minutes?" It's standard procedure. His tone was still polite, but there was an edge to it now that made every instinct in my body start screaming. I'd never seen this man before in my life, and I'd lived in this neighborhood for 6 years. Our local deputies knew most of the residents by sight, and this guy definitely wasn't one of them. The badge he was holding didn't look quite right either. Too shiny, too new, like something you'd order online. "I'm sorry, but I'm going to need to see some proper identification," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "And I'd like to call the sheriff's office to verify this wellness check." The moment those words left my mouth, his entire demeanor changed, His friendly, professional mask slipped completely. The tired eyes turned cold and calculating, and he stepped closer to my door with a confidence that made my chest tighten. "Ma'am, I really need you to cooperate here," he said, his voice dropping to something quieter, more menacing. "This is an official matter, and I have the authority to enter if necessary." Before I could respond, he pushed against my door with surprising force. The chain latch held, but I could feel the metal straining against the door frame. Panic shot through me like electricity, and I slammed the door shut, immediately turning the deadbolt. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Through the door, I heard him chuckle. Actually, chuckle like this was all some kind of game to him. "Catherine, that wasn't very smart," he called out, his voice calm and conversational. "I know you're a teacher at Riverside Elementary, 3rd grade, right? Room 15B. You drive that blue Toyota Camry with a dented bumper." The details hit me like physical blows. He knew where I worked, what I drove, even my classroom number. This wasn't random. This had been planned. I backed away from the door, my mind racing through every possible explanation, but none of them made sense. How long had he been watching me? How did he know so much? My phone was still on the kitchen table with my grading papers, but I was terrified to turn my back on the door. Then I heard the sound that made my knees nearly give out. The soft scrape of metal on metal. He was doing something to my lock. "You know, Catherine," he continued, his voice muffled, but still audible. "I've been watching you for weeks. You have quite a routine. Saturday afternoons grading papers, Sunday mornings at that little coffee shop on Maple Street where you always sit in the corner booth. You're very predictable." The scraping sound continued, methodical and patient. I realized with growing horror that he wasn't just trying to break in. He was picking my lock like he'd done it 100 times before. I spun around and sprinted toward the staircase, taking the steps two at a time. My sock slipped on the hardwood, and I nearly fell, catching myself on the banister. Behind me, I heard the distinctive click of my front door opening. "There we go," he said, his voice now inside my house, casual as if he'd been invited in for tea. "Much better now, Catherine. There's no need to make this difficult. I just want to talk." His footsteps were slow, deliberate, like he was taking his time to examine everything. I could hear him moving through my living room, probably studying the family photos on my mantel, the stack of books on my coffee table. "You have a nice place here," he called out. "Very cozy. I especially like that photo of you and your sister from last Christmas, the one where you're wearing that red sweater. You both look so happy." The fact that he could identify my sister from a photo made my vision blur with terror. How long had he been planning this? How much did he know about my life? I reached the top of the stairs and dove into my bathroom, slamming the door and turning the lock. It was a flimsy interior door lock, the kind that could probably be opened with a butter knife, but it was the only barrier I had. My phone. I needed my phone, but it was still downstairs on the kitchen table, and there was no way I was going back down there. I frantically searched the bathroom for anything that could help. My hands were trembling so badly, I could barely grip anything. In the medicine cabinet, I found my old cell phone, the one I kept as a backup. The battery was nearly dead, showing only 8%, but it was enough. I dialed 911 with shaking fingers while sitting on the bathroom floor, pressed against the door. 911. "What's your emergency?" The dispatcher's voice was calm and professional, a lifeline in the chaos. "There's a man in my house," I whispered, barely able to get the words out. "He pretended to be a police officer, but he's not. He's been watching me. He knows things about me. Please send help." Downstairs, I could hear him moving around, opening doors, his voice carrying up the stairs. "Catherine, I can hear you up there," he called out, his tone still unnaturally calm. "I'm not here to hurt you. I just need to ask you some questions about your student, little Ashley Bennett." You remember Ashley, don't you? Blonde hair, always wears those pink sneakers with the sparkles. My entire body went rigid. Ashley was, in my class, a sweet 8-year-old who struggled with reading but tried so hard. What did he want with her? I know you stay after school sometimes to help her with her homework, he continued. And I could hear him climbing the stairs now, each footstep, deliberate and measured. Her mother works late shifts at the hospital, doesn't she? Ashley walks home alone most days. The dispatcher was asking me questions, but I could barely focus on her words. This man knew my students, knew their routines, knew which ones were vulnerable. Ma'am, officers are en route to your location, the dispatcher said. Stay on the line with me. Can you tell me where you are in the house? I pressed my mouth close to the phone. Upstairs bathroom. He's coming up the stairs. He knows about my students. He was right outside the bathroom door now. I could see the shadow of his feet in the gap beneath the door. Catherine, I know you're in there, and I know you're on the phone with someone. That's okay. We have plenty of time. The doorknob turned slowly, testing the lock. You see, I've been planning this conversation for months. I know everything about you, about your routine, about the kids in your class, especially the ones who walk home alone. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The ones whose parents work late. The ones who might not be missed for a few hours. The implications of his words hit me like a physical assault. This wasn't just about me. He was targeting my students, using me to get to them. I'm going to need you to give me some information, Catherine, about Ashley. Specifically her address, her schedule, when her mother works, simple things. The lock on the bathroom door was starting to give way under his manipulation. I could hear the metal components shifting, and I knew I had maybe seconds before he got through. Officers are 2 minutes away, the dispatcher assured me, but 2 minutes felt like a lifetime. The bathroom lock finally gave way with a soft click, and the door swung open. He stood in the doorway, looking down at me with those cold, calculating eyes up close. I could see that his badge was obviously fake, a cheap plastic thing that wouldn't fool anyone who looked closely. But what terrified me most was how calm he appeared. Like breaking into houses and terrorizing teachers was just another Tuesday for him. Hang up the phone, Catherine, he said quietly. We need to talk privately. I clutched the phone tighter, keeping the dispatcher on the line. No, I managed to say, my voice barely a whisper. I'm not hanging up, and I'm not telling you anything about my students. He sighed like I was being unreasonable. You're making this harder than it needs to be. I'm not going to hurt you if you just cooperate, but I will get what I came for one way or another. That's when I heard it. The beautiful, beautiful sound of sirens in the distance, growing louder. By the second, his expression changed instantly, the calm mask slipping to reveal something desperate and angry underneath. The sirens were getting closer, and suddenly he wasn't the composed predator anymore. He was just a man who realized his plan was falling apart. This isn't over, Catherine, he said, backing away from the bathroom door. I know where you work, where you live, where you shop. I know everything about you. But there was panic in his voice now, and I could hear him running down the stairs, his footsteps heavy and hurried. The front door slammed, and moments later, I heard car doors slamming outside, officers shouting commands. I stayed in that bathroom for another 10 minutes, even after the police came inside and called out that it was safe. When I finally came downstairs, there were 4 officers in my living room, and they told me they'd caught him trying to drive away in a stolen car 3 blocks from my house. Turns out his real name was Vincent Walsh, and he had a history of targeting teachers to get information about vulnerable students. The fake badge, the manufactured wellness check, the detailed knowledge of my routine, it was all part of a systematic approach he'd used into other states. They found photos of me, my house, my car, and detailed notes about my students in his possession. I never went back to that house. Even with him in custody, I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd left something behind in those rooms, some invisible contamination that made the space feel permanently unsafe. Looking back, I should have trusted my gut from the very first day I saw that van. I was 16 at the time, junior year of high school, living in this quiet suburban neighborhood in Denver with my parents. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where kids still rode bikes without helmets and parents didn't lock their doors during the day. I was your typical high school kid, played varsity soccer, had a part-time job at the local pizza place on weekends, spent most of my free time gaming or hanging out with my girlfriend Lisa. Life was pretty normal, predictable, even. My daily routine was simple: catch the bus at 7:15, survive another day of chemistry and algebra, then walk the 3 blocks home around 3:30 p.m. Nothing ever changed in our neighborhood, which is exactly why that white van stood out like a sore thumb from day one. The van started showing up on a Tuesday in late September. I remember because it was the same day we had our first big soccer scrimmage, and I was walking home with my gear bag slung over my shoulder, already planning my afternoon snack attack on the kitchen. That's when I first noticed it. This beat-up, white cargo van parked directly across the street from our house, maybe 40 feet from our front door. The thing looked like it belonged to some contractor or maintenance crew, with rust spots along the wheel wells and a dent in the passenger side door that looked like someone had backed into a pole. But what struck me as weird was that it was just sitting there, engine off, no one around. No work trucks, no guys in hardits, no construction happening anywhere on the block. I shrugged it off that first day, figured someone was visiting the Millers who lived in the house was parked in front of. But then I saw it again the next day and the day after that. By the end of the first week, I realized this wasn't some random coincidence. The van appeared like clockwork every single afternoon, always between 3 and 3:30 p.m., right around the time I got home from school. It would sit there 4 hours, sometimes until after dark, then disappear overnight, only to return the next day. The windows were tinted dark enough that I couldn't see inside, but I could tell someone was in there because occasionally I'd catch a glimpse of movement in the driver's seat. Just subtle shifts, like someone adjusting their position or maybe checking their phone. The really creepy part was that whoever was inside never got out. No tents, not to stretch their legs, not to use the bathroom, nothing. They just sat there day after day, watching our street. I started timing my walks from the bus stop, and sure enough, the van was always there before I arrived home. What made it even more disturbing was how the driver seemed to know my schedule better than I did. On the days I had soccer practice and got home later around 5:30 p.m, the van would still be there waiting. When I had early dismissal for teacher conferences and walked home at 2:15 p.m, there it was, parked in the exact same spot. It was like whoever was inside had studied my routine and adjusted their schedule to match mine perfectly. I started paying closer attention to the van's details, memorizing everything I could. The license plate was from Colorado, but covered in mud, making it impossible to read the numbers clearly. There was a small crack in the rear window that looked like a spider web, and the left tail light had red tape covering what was probably a broken lens. The more I noticed these details, the more convinced I became that this wasn't just some coincidence or innocent explanation. Someone was definitely watching our house, and more specifically, they were watching me. After 2 weeks of this pattern, I decided to tell my parents about it. Big mistake. When I brought it up during dinner, my dad just laughed and said I was being paranoid, that it was probably just someone who worked nearby and found a convenient parking spot. My mom was a bit more concerned, but suggested maybe it was an undercover cop doing surveillance on drug dealers, or something equally ridiculous. They both brushed off my concerns like I was some kid with an overactive imagination. The worst part was when my dad said, "Jake, you watch too many crime shows. No, everything is a conspiracy." That stung because I knew what I was seeing was real, and their dismissal made me feel like I was going crazy. I tried explaining how the van's timing perfectly matched my schedule, how the driver never got out, how the windows were too dark to see inside. But they just exchanged those patronizing looks that parents give when they think their teenager is being dramatic. The situation escalated about a week later, when I noticed the van had started showing up on weekends, too. Not just during my school schedule anymore, but on Saturday and Sunday afternoons when I was home. This was new, and it made my stomach churn with anxiety. I began testing my theory by changing my routines deliberately. I'd leave through the back door and walk around the block to see if the van would follow me, but it always stayed in the same spot. I started closing my bedroom curtains during the day, which was something I'd never done before because I loved natural light. But the idea that someone might be watching me through my window made my skin crawl. One particular likely incident happened on a Thursday when I was walking home from school and decided to stare directly at the van's windshield as I passed by. I couldn't see the driver clearly, but I swear I saw the silhouette of someone's head turn to follow my movement. That night, I barely slept and I kept checking the window to see if the van was still there in the darkness. The whole thing came to a head on a Friday evening in mid-November. My parents had driven to Boulder to visit my Aunt Linda, who was recovering from surgery, and they wouldn't be back until Sunday afternoon. I was used to being home alone. At 16, I was old enough to handle a weekend by myself, and I actually looked forward to the freedom. I had plans to order pizza, binge watch some Netflix shows, and maybe have my girlfriend Lisa come over on Saturday night. The van had been there when I got home from school that afternoon, same as always. But by the time evening rolled around, it had disappeared like it usually did after dark. I remember feeling relieved, thinking maybe I'd have a peaceful weekend without that constant feeling of being watched. I ordered Chinese takeout around 7:00 p.m, settled in with my laptop to do some homework, and tried to push all thoughts of the van out of my mind. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of settling wood that old houses make. Around 9:30 p.m, I was sitting at the kitchen table working on a history essay when I heard the first sound. It was subtle, almost like a scraping noise coming from somewhere toward the back of the house. I paused my typing and listened carefully, but the sound stopped. I figured it was probably just our cat Whiskers knocking something over upstairs, so I went back to my homework. But then I heard it again, more distinct this time, a metallic, clicking sound like someone was trying to turn a doorknob or manipulate a lock. The sound was coming from the direction of our backsliding door, which led out to the small patio and backyard. My heart started racing because I knew for certain that I had locked that door earlier in the evening. I always double-checked all the locks when my parents were away, and I distinctly remembered testing the sliding door handle to make sure it was secure. The clicking sound came again, more persistent this time, followed by what sounded like someone gently pushing against the door frame. I slowly closed my laptop and stood up from the kitchen table, trying to move as quietly as possible. The sounds were definitely coming from the sliding door, and they were getting more frequent. What terrified me most was how methodical they sounded, not like someone trying to break in violently, but like someone who knew exactly what they were doing and was taking their time. I tiptoed toward the back hallway, my socks silent on the hardwood floor, and pressed myself against the wall near the corner where I could listen more clearly. The clicking sounds continued, now accompanied by what sounded like someone testing the door's security bar that we always kept in the track. I could hear the faint scraping of metal against metal. Whoever was outside tried to manipulate the lock mechanism. The most bone-chilling part was how patient this person was being. They weren't rushing, weren't making noise that would alert the neighbors, just working steadily and quietly to get inside. I realized with growing horror that this wasn't some random break-in attempt. This was someone who had been watching our house long enough to know that my parents were away and that I was home alone. That's when the unthinkable happened. The sounds stopped coming from outside the sliding door, and instead I heard the unmistakable sound of the door actually opening. But here's the part that still gives me nightmares. The sound wasn't coming from outside trying to get in. It was coming from inside the house, like someone was already inside and trying to open the door to let someone else in. I heard the distinctive whoosh of the heavy glass door sliding in, its track followed by the security bar being lifted and set aside. My mind couldn't process what I was hearing because it was impossible. No one else was supposed to be in the house. I'd been alone all evening, and I would have heard if someone had broken in through another entrance, but the sounds were undeniable. Someone was definitely inside my house moving around near the back door, and they were opening it from the inside. The metallic scraping I had been hearing wasn't someone trying to break in from outside. It was someone who was already inside working to unlock the door and remove the security measures from the interior side. Pure terror hit me like a freight train. I stood there in the hallway, barely breathing, trying to figure out how Simeon could have gotten into my house without me knowing. That's when I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the kitchen tile, heading toward the living room where I had been sitting just minutes before. I pressed myself harder against the wall, my heart pounding so loud. I was sure whoever was in my house would hear it. The footsteps stopped, and I heard the unmistakable sound of my laptop being opened. Thepperson was checking what I had been doing, probably looking at my homework to confirm, was really home alone. Then I heard something that made my knees nearly buckle, the sound of our front door opening. Someone was letting another person into the house. I heard hushed voices, to different people whispering to each other, but I couldn't make out what they were saying. The realization hit me that there were now at least 2 intruders in my house, and they had been coordinating this whole thing. The van, the weeks of surveillance, the timing when my parents were away, this had all been planned. I knew I had to act fast. Still pressed against the wall, I carefully reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely unlock the screen, but I managed to dial 911 without making any sound. When the operator answered, I whispered as quietly as possible, "Someone's in my house. To people. I'm hiding. Send help now." I gave her my address and stayed on the line, like she instructed. The voices in the living room were getting closer, and I could hear them moving through the house systematically, like they were searching for something or someone. I realized they were looking for me. I made a split-second decision to try to get upstairs to my parents' bedroom, where I could lock the door and have a better view of the street to watch for the police. As I started to move toward the staircase, staying low and moving as silently as possible, I heard one of them say, clearly, "Check upstairs. He's got to be around here somewhere." The voice was male, older, and spoke with the kind of confidence that suggested this wasn't his first time doing something like this. I made it to the top of the stairs, just as I heard the first police sirens. In the distance, still several blocks away, but getting closer. The sirens seemed to spook the intruders, because I heard rapid movement downstairs, like they were suddenly in a hurry to leave. I locked myself in my parents' bedroom and watched from their window as 3 police cars pulled up in front of our house, their red and blue lights flashing across the entire street. The officers moved quickly, surrounding the house with their flashlights drawn. I heard shouting from downstairs, commands like, "Police, show me your hands," and the sound of heavy boots on our hardwood floors. Within minutes, I heard the 911 operator telling me it was safe to come downstairs and identify myself to the officers. When I finally made it back to the living room, I saw 2 men in handcuffs. One was around 40, with greasy brown hair and a scraggly beard. The other was younger, maybe mid-20s, with multiple tattoos covering his arms. Neither of them looked familiar, and they wouldn't make eye contact with me. The older officer, Sergeant Williams, explained that they had caught both men trying to escape through our backyard when the police arrived. They had been hiding in our basement the entire time, waiting for the right moment to make their move. Here's the part that still haunts me to this day. The police investigation revealed that these guys had been casing our house for almost 2 months, not just 3 weeks like I thought. They had somehow gotten into our basement through an old storm cellar entrance that my parents didn't even know was accessible. The entrance was hidden behind some overgrown bushes on the side of our house, and the lock had been broken for who knows how long. They had been coming and going through that entrance, studying our family's routines, learning when we were home and when we weren't. The white van was just their observation post, but their actual base of operations was right under our feet. The whole time, the police found sleeping bags, food wrappers, and even photos they had taken of me and my family going about our daily lives. Sergeant Williams told me that if I hadn't called when I did, they probably would have waited until I was asleep and then made their move. The thought of what could have happened still makes me sick to my stomach. The 2 men were part of a larger operation that targeted suburban families, specifically looking for houses with teenagers who might be home alone on weekends. They never told the police exactly what their plan was for me, but based on what the detectives found in their van and in our basement, it wasn't good. My parents came home immediately when the police called them, and we ended up moving to a different neighborhood within 2 months. I never found out what happened to those guys in court because my parents wanted to put the whole thing behind us and move on, but I learned to trust my instincts that day. If something feels wrong, if you notice patterns that don't make sense, don't let anyone tell you you're being paranoid. Sometimes the thing you're afraid of is exactly what you should be afraid of. I still check locks twice, and I still look carefully at any vehicle that stays parked on my street for more than a day. Some experiences change you forever, and this was definitely one of them. So, I'm sitting here at 200 a.m., still wide awake after what happened yesterday. And I figured I'd share this with you guys, because honestly, I need to talk about this. Maybe someone else has experienced something similar, or maybe I'm just being paranoid. But either way, here goes. I'm a 28-year-old graphic designer who works from home most days. Live alone in a small rental house in Austin, Texas. Nothing fancy, just a quiet neighborhood where most people mind their own business. Yesterday was a typical Tuesday in November 2024, overcast and chilly. The kind of day where you're grateful to be inside with a hot cup of coffee. I'd been working on a logo design 4 hours, completely absorbed in my computer screen when the doorbell rang around 6:30 p.m. Wasn't expecting anyone, but figured it was probably a package or maybe one of my neighbors. I glanced through the peephole and saw this guy standing there holding what looked like a bag of takeout food, tall, probably in his 30s, wearing a red baseball cap pulled low and a dark jacket. He had this nervous energy about him, constantly shifting his weight from foot to foot, looking around like he was checking to see if anyone was watching. The weird thing was, he wasn't wearing any delivery uniform or anything that would identify him as working for a restaurant. No car in my driveway either, which I thought was strange. Usually delivery drivers park right in front of the house, but I couldn't see any vehicle from my front door. I opened the door just a crack, keeping the chain lock on, and he immediately perked up with this overly friendly smile. "Hey there, got your Chinese food order here," he said, holding up the bag. Problem was, I hadn't ordered any Chinese food. Hadn't ordered anything at all that day. "Sorry, but I didn't order anything," I told him through the crack in the door. "You must have the wrong address." His smile faltered for just a second, and I noticed his eyes dart past me like he was trying to see inside my house. "Are you sure? This is 1247 Maple Street, right?" He was correct about my address, which made me pause. Maybe someone had legitimately made a mistake with the order. But when I confirmed it was the right address, but insisted I hadn't ordered anything, he didn't seem disappointed or confused like a real delivery driver would be. Instead, he kept standing there, still holding the bag, like he was waiting for something. "Well, maybe it's a surprise from a friend or family member," he suggested, his voice taking on this weird, almost pleading tone. The whole interaction was starting to make me uncomfortable, so I just shook my head and said I was sorry, but I couldn't accept food I hadn't ordered. That's when he finally stepped back from the door. I watched through the peephole as he walked away, but instead of heading to a car, he just disappeared from view. I figured he'd gone to his vehicle parked somewhere I couldn't see, maybe around the corner or something. Went back to my computer, trying to focus on work, but I kept getting distracted by this nagging feeling that something about the whole encounter was off. About 10 minutes later, I heard what sounded like footsteps on my back patio. My house has this wooden deck that cracks whenever someone walks on it, and I know that sound well. I live alone, so any noise back there immediately puts me on alert. I crept to my back door and peered through the blinds, but it was getting dark and I couldn't see much. The footsteps stopped and I convinced myself it was probably just a raccoon or maybe my neighbor's cat. But then I heard the distinct sound of someone testing my back door handle. That metallic click of someone trying to turn it. My heart started racing. That wasn't an animal. I grabbed my phone and opened the app for my doorbell camera, which I'd installed a few months ago after some packages went missing in the neighborhood. The camera has a pretty good view of my front yard and driveway, and I figured if someone was trying to break in, they might have come around to the front first. What I saw made my stomach turn. There he was, the same guy from earlier, the fake delivery driver, standing at the edge of my driveway, just staring at my house. He'd taken off the red baseball cap, and now I could see his face more clearly. He looked focused, determined, like he was studying the layout of my property. As I watched, he started walking slowly around the perimeter of my yard, stopping at each window and cupping his hands against the glass to peer inside. The way he moved was deliberate, methodical, like he'd done this before. He wasn't some confused delivery guy anymore. He was clearly casing my house. I ducked down below my living room window as he approached it, my pulse hammering in my ears. Through the app, I could see him pressing his face against glass, his breath fogging up the window as he tried to see inside. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, just looking. Then he moved to the next window and the next. I realized he was checking every single window on the first floor, testing which ones might be unlocked, figuring out the best entry point. The food delivery had been a complete lie. He'd used it as an excuse to see if anyone was home to get a look at me, to case the joint. When I'd answered the door, he'd gotten the confirmation he needed. A woman living alone with no obvious security measures. Now he was back to finish whatever he'd started. I watched him disappear around the side of the house toward my bedroom window. And that's when I knew I had to do something. Calling the police seemed like the obvious choice, but I needed more evidence, more proof of what was happening. I started recording everything on my phone. Screenshots of the doorbell camera footage, the timestamp showing when he'd first appeared, his methodical inspection of my property. My bedroom is on the back corner of the house, and I could hear him out there. The sound of his footsteps on the gravel beneath my window. He was being careful, trying to stay quiet, but the small rocks gave him away every time he shifted his weight. I crept to my bedroom and carefully lifted one corner of the blinds. There he was, maybe 3 feet away from me, separated only by a thin pane of glass. He was running his fingers along the window frame, checking the lock mechanism, seeing if there was any give. His face was illuminated by the security light from my neighbor's yard, and I could see the concentration in his expression. This wasn't random. He knew exactly what he was looking for. He pulled out his phone and used the flashlight to examine the window latch more closely. That's when I noticed he was wearing gloves now, thin black ones that he definitely hadn't been wearing during the fake delivery attempt. The sight of those gloves made everything click into place. This wasn't just someone casing houses for a future break-in. This was happening right now, tonight. He was preparing to get inside my house, and those gloves meant he didn't want to leave fingerprints. I watched in horror as he produced a small tool from his pocket, something thin and metallic, that he started working into the gap between the window and the frame. He was trying to jimmy the lock, and from the practiced way he was doing it, this clearly wasn't his first time. My window is old, probably original to the house, and the lock mechanism isn't the most secure. I could see him making progress, the tool slipping deeper into the gap with each careful manipulation. The metallic scratching sound was barely audible, but in the dead silence of the evening, it might as well have been nails on a chalkboard. I realized I had made minutes before he got that window open, and once he was inside, I'd be trapped in my own house with someone who'd gone through elaborate lengths to get to me. The fake delivery, the reconnaissance, the gloves, the tools, this was all premeditated, and I was the target. That's when I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of calling 911 and waiting for police to arrive, I decided to make as much noise as possible. I ran to my living room and turned on every single light in the house, then cranked up my stereo system to maximum volume. The sudden blast of music echoing through the neighborhood was jarring, but it had the intended effect. Through my bedroom window, I could see him jerk back in surprise, his tool clattering to the ground. He looked around frantically, probably wondering if the noise meant I'd spotted him, or if other people would come to investigate. I kept the music blaring and started flashing my porch lights on and off repeatedly, creating a strobing effect that lit up the entire front yard. My neighbor across the street, Mrs. Peterson, came out onto her porch to see what the commotion was about. That's when I saw him make his move. He abandoned the window completely and started jogging toward the street, keeping his head down and his hands in his pockets. I watched through my doorbell camera as he disappeared down the sidewalk, moving quickly but not quite running, like he was trying not to draw attention to himself. I called 911 while keeping the lights and music going, figuring it was better to be safe than sorry. The dispatcher took my report seriously, especially when I mentioned the tools and gloves, and sent a patrol car within 15 minutes. The officer was this older guy, Sergeant Martinez, who'd clearly seen his share of weird situations. He walked the perimeter of my house with a flashlight, found the tool the guy had dropped beneath my bedroom window. Turned out to be a modified screwdriver designed for forcing locks. He also found footprints in the soft dirt around several of my windows, confirming what I'd witnessed. Martinez explained that this was actually a known method used by some burglars, and worse, they'd pose as delivery drivers to scope out potential targets, looking for people who lived alone, checking security measures, noting entry points. The fake delivery wasn't just about seeing if anyone was home. It was about getting a good look at me, seeing if I seemed vulnerable, assessing whether I'd be an easy target. He said I'd done exactly the right thing by making noise and drawing attention, because predators like this rely on stealth and anonymity. Once the whole neighborhood was aware something was happening, he had no choice but to retreat. Martinez filed a detailed report and took all my doorbell camera footage as evidence. He also connected my case to two similar incidents that had happened in nearby neighborhoods over the past month. Fake delivery attempts followed by attempted break-ins, all targeting women living alone. Apparently, I was the first one who'd managed to get clear footage of the perpetrator and evidence of his methods. The investigation is still ongoing, but Martinez told me they're confident they'll catch this guy eventually. He also helped me upgrade my home security that same week. Better window locks, motion sensor lights, and a more comprehensive camera system. I haven't seen the fake delivery guy since that night, but I also haven't answered my door for any unexpected visitors. The whole experience taught me to trust my instincts. That nagging feeling I had during the initial encounter was my subconscious picking up on danger signals I couldn't consciously identify. Now, I tell everyone I know, if someone shows up at your door with food you didn't order, don't just politely decline. Pay attention to whether they seem genuinely confused or if they're lingering. looking around, asking questions. Real delivery drivers have other stops to make. They don't have time to stand around trying to convince you to take food that isn't yours. And if something feels wrong, make noise, get attention. Don't worry about seeming rude or paranoid. Sometimes being loud and obnoxious is exactly what keeps you safe. Being 42 and divorced isn't exactly where I thought I'd be at this stage of my life. But here we are. The weekends when I drop off my kids at their mom's house always leave me feeling hollow inside. Like there's this weird echo in my chest that won't go away. That particular Friday in March 2019, I'd spent the evening with my two boys, Tyler, who's 8, and Sam, who's 10, helping them with homework and making sure they brushed their teeth before bed. Their mom, Janet, was working late again, which meant I got to do the bedtime routine at her place instead of mine. The drive back to my own house felt longer than usual. Maybe because I was dreading another weekend alone in that quiet ranch house I'd bought after the divorce. The neighborhood was one of those newer developments on the outskirts of Phoenix, where all three houses look similar and the street lights cast these harsh white circles on the pavement. I remember thinking how different it felt from the cozy family home we used to share, where every corner held memories of birthday parties and Christmas mornings. When I got home around 9:30, I grabbed a beer from the fridge and collapsed onto the couch, flipping through channels until I landed on some old action movie from the 90s. The house felt too big and too empty, the way it always did when the kids weren't there to fill it with their laughter and constant chatter. I must have dozed off somewhere during the second act, because the next thing I knew, I was being jolted awake by this sudden brightness flooding through the sliding glass door that led to my back patio. My heart was already racing from being startled out of sleep, and it took me a few seconds to realize what had happened. The motion-activated lights outside had kicked on. I glanced at the cable box clock and saw it was 3:14 in the morning, which made me groan because I knew I'd have a crick in my neck from sleeping on the couch. The TV was still on, some infomercial about kitchen knives playing at low volume, and I was about to reach for the remote when I saw him. There was a man standing just outside my back door, perfectly still, facing the glass. He was tall, maybe 6 feet, wearing what looked like a dark jacket or hoodie. And even though I couldn't make out his face clearly through the glass, I could tell he was looking directly at me. My first thought was that it had to be one of my neighbors, probably old Mr. Henderson from next door, who had a habit of wandering around his yard at odd hours when he'd had too much to drink. The guy had done stranger things before, like the time I found him trying to unlock my car door, thinking it was his own. So, I did what seemed logical at the time. I reached for the light switch near the door and flipped it off, figuring that would give him the hint to head back to his own house. The patio went dark again, and I waited for the sound of footsteps on the concrete, or maybe the creak of the side gate opening and closing, but nothing happened. The silence stretched on for what felt like minutes, and I started to wonder if maybe he'd left and I just hadn't heard him. I got up from the couch, my joints protesting after the awkward nap, and walked closer to the glass door. My reflection stared back at me from the dark surface, making it impossible to see outside clearly. I cubed my hands around my eyes and pressed my face against the cool glass, trying to peer into the darkness of my backyard. The motion sensor kicked in again, flooding the patio with that harsh white light, and my heart nearly jumped out of my chest. He was still there, hadn't moved an inch from where he'd been standing bare. But now I could see him more clearly, and what I saw made my stomach twist into a knot. This wasn't Mr. Henderson. This guy was younger, maybe in his 30s, with greasy black hair that hung down to his shoulders and a pale, gaunt face that looked almost skeletal under the bright lights. His clothes were dirty and torn in places, like he'd been living rough for a while, and there was something in his eyes that made me take a step back from the glass. He wasn't looking around confused like a drunk person would. He was staring directly at me with this intense, focused gaze that made my skin crawl. What really got to me was his posture. He stood completely motionless, like a statue, with his arms hanging straight down at his sides. Normal people don't stand like that, especially not when they're caught doing something they shouldn't be doing. Most people would wave or look embarrassed or at least acknowledge that they'd been seen, but this guy just kept staring at me with those hollow, sunken eyes. And I realized with growing dread that he wasn't there by accident. I backed away from the door and fumbled around for my phone, which was somewhere on the couch cushions. My mind was racing with all the possibilities. Maybe he was high on something, or maybe he was casing the house for a robbery or worse. The smart thing would have been to call the police right then and there. But part of me was still hoping this was all some kind of misunderstanding. Maybe he was mentally ill and didn't know where he was. Or maybe he was looking for help and didn't know how to ask for it. I found my phone wedged between the couch cushions and pulled it out. The screen lighting up and showing several missed calls from Janet, probably about something related to the kids' weekend plans. The light from the phone made me realize how dark the living room had become with the patio lights off, and I could barely make out the shapes of my furniture. I turned the phone's flashlight on and pointed it toward the glass door, but all I could see was my own reflection bouncing back at me. The motion sensor hadn't triggered again, which meant either he'd left or he was standing perfectly still in the darkness, just beyond the range of the detector. The thought of him being out there, hidden in the shadows of my backyard, made my pulse quicken. I decided to try a different approach and walked over to the wall switch that controlled the interior lights near the back door. If I turned those on, maybe I could get a better view of what was happening outside without triggering the motion sensor again. The overhead lights flickered on, bathing the living room with a warm yellow glow that made everything feel more normal. For a moment, I approached the glass door again, this time more cautiously, and pressed my face against it to look outside. The patio was still dark, but I could make out the shapes of my outdoor furniture. The small table and 2 chairs I'd bought last summer, the barbecue grill covered with a tarp, and the potted plants Janet had left behind when she moved out. Everything looked normal, peaceful even, and I started to think maybe the guy had finally gotten the message and left. But then I heard it, a soft, rhythmic tapping sound coming from somewhere along the side of the house. It was quiet, almost polite, like someone gently knocking on a door. Tap, tap, tap. Then silence for a few seconds, followed by another series of taps. The sound was coming from the direction of my bedroom window, which faced the narrow strip of yard between my house and the neighbor's fence. I stood there in my living room, listening to that methodical tapping, and felt this creeping realization that whoever was out there wasn't just passing through. He was systematically checking different parts of my house. The tapping would stop for a minute or two, then start up again from what sounded like a slightly different location. First, it was near the bedroom window. Then, it moved toward what I thought might be the guest bathroom window on the side of the house. Each time, the same pattern, gentle, persistent tapping, like he was testing something or trying to get my attention. I grabbed a baseball bat from the hall closet, one of those aluminum ones left over from when I used to play in a weekend league before the divorce. The weight of it in my grip made me feel slightly more confident, though I'd never actually used it as a weapon before. I crept through the house following the sound from window to window. But every time I got close enough to peek through the blinds, the tapping would stop. It was like he knew exactly where I was and was always one step ahead of me. The whole situation had this surreal quality to it, like I was trapped in some kind of twisted game of cat and mouse where I didn't know the rules. Around 4 in the morning, the tapping finally stopped completely, and the silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. At least, when I could hear him, I knew roughly where he was and what he was doing. But now, the quiet stretched on, and I found myself straining to hear any sound that might give away his location. I made myself a cup of coffee, partly because I needed the caffeine and partly because I knew there was no way was going back to sleep that night. The kitchen felt exposed, with its big window facing the backyard. So, I kept the lights off and moved around carefully, trying not to create any silhouettes that might be visible from outside. Every few minutes, I'd check the locks on all the doors and windows. Even though I'd already checked them multiple times, the front door had a deadbolt and a chain. The back door had a deadbolt and one of those sliding bar locks. And all the windows had their standard latches engaged. I even checked the basement door, though I couldn't imagine why anyone would try to get in that way. As I was doing my rounds, I heard a new sound that made my blood freeze. A slow scraping noise, like something heavy being dragged across concrete. The scraping sound was coming from the back patio area, and it had this deliberate, methodical quality that suggested whoever was out there was moving something with purpose. I could hear it clearly through the glass door. A rhythmic scrape, pause, as if someone was repositioning heavy objects one by one. My mind immediately went to the worst case scenario. He was moving my patio furniture to create some kind of makeshift ladder or barricade. Maybe he was stacking the chairs on top of the table to reach a higher window. Or maybe he was clearing a path for something even worse. The scraping went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes. And then it stopped as abruptly as it had begun. I stood in my darkened kitchen, gripping the baseball bat so tightly my knuckles ached, and waited for whatever was going to happen next. The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility, and I found myself jumping at every tiny sound. The hum of the refrigerator, the settling of the house, the distant rumble of an early morning delivery truck on the main road. I kept thinking about my kids, grateful they were safe at their mother's house, and not here with me dealing with this nightmare. Just as the first hints of dawn were starting to creep through the windows, I heard the most terrifying sound yet. The distinctive click of a door latch being turned, but it wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the house, specifically from the direction of the back door. The sound was unmistakable, the soft metallic click of the deadbolt being slowly, carefully turned from the inside. I knew that sound intimately because I'd heard it thousands of times. It was the sound of someone unlocking my back door, but somehow, impossibly, it was happening from within my own house. My entire body went cold as the implications hit me. Either someone had gotten inside without me knowing it, or there was something fundamentally wrong with my understanding of the situation. I crept toward the back of the house, the bat raised and ready, my heart hammering so hard I was sure it could be heard from outside. The living room was still bathed in that yellow overhead light, and as I approached the glass door, I could see that the deadbolt was indeed unlocked. The little brass thumb turn was in the horizontal position, even though I was absolutely certain had checked it just an hour earlier, and found it securely locked in the vertical position. Standing there staring at that unlocked deadbolt, I felt like reality was slipping away from me. There was no logical explanation for how that lock could have been turned from the inside unless someone was already in the house with me. But I'd been awake 4 hours moving through every room, and I hadn't seen or heard anyone inside. The only other possibility was that I was losing my mind, that the stress of the divorce and the loneliness were finally catching up to me in the worst possible way. I approached the door slowly, bat raised, and peered through the glass into the pre-dawn darkness of my backyard. The motion sensor triggered again, flooding the patio with light, and what I saw made my legs nearly give out beneath me. All of my patio furniture had been carefully arranged in a perfect circle around the door, the table, both chairs, even the heavy ceramic planters that I could barely lift by myself. But more disturbing than the arrangement itself was the fact that each piece of furniture had been positioned to face inward, toward the glass door, like an audience waiting for a performance. In the center of this bizarre circle, pressed against the glass, was a single muddy handprint that definitely hadn't been there before. That's when I finally called the police. I didn't care anymore if I looked paranoid or crazy. I just wanted someone else to witness what was happening and tell me I wasn't imagining it all. The dispatcher was professional, but I could hear the skepticism in her voice when I tried to explain about the furniture arrangements and the unlocked door, too. Patrol officers arrived about 15 minutes later, and they were surprisingly thorough in their investigation. They walked around the entire perimeter of the house, checked all the windows and doors, and even looked for footprints in the soft dirt around the foundation. Officer Gutierrez, a middle-aged Hispanic woman with kind eyes, told me they'd found evidence that someone had definitely been on my property. Disturbed mulch, footprints, and what looked like drag marks on the concrete patio. But here's the thing that still haunts me to this day. When we went back to examine the door together, the deadbolt was locked again. Not just locked, but locked tight, like it had been turned with considerable force. Neither of the officers saw me touch it, and I swear on my children's lives that I never went near that lock after discovering it was open. The muddy handprint was gone, too, and the patio furniture was back in its normal positions. Officer Gutierrez suggested I might want to install a security camera system, and I took her advice the very next day. I never saw the strange man again, but sometimes on quiet nights when the kids are at their mother's house, I still hear that soft, persistent tapping on the windows. I just signed the lease on a small one-bedroom on the second floor of a brick building near the edge of town, the kind of place with cheap carpet, off-white walls, and neighbors you rarely see, unless you're doing laundry at the same time. Honestly, I wasn't being picky. I just needed out. Out of that apartment I used to share with Rob. Out of the silence that followed every fight. And out of the constant reminder of the person I didn't recognize him to be anymore. It wasn't one thing that ended it, more like a slow decay. By the end, even our arguments felt mechanical. So, when I moved into this new place, I thought I was finally choosing peace, even if that peace was sitting alone on a hand-down futon surrounded by cardboard boxes and silence. I worked the morning shift at a retail store about 15 minutes away. It was nothing glamorous, clothes, hangers, fluorescent lights, but the hours were steady and I got home before it got dark. I'd usually pick up something from the deli downstairs or throw together pasta while scrolling mindlessly on my phone. The building itself was quiet, sometimes eerily so. The hallway lights flickered now and then, and the guy across from me always left his shoes facing the wrong direction outside his door, which bugged me more than it should have. But for the most part, it was uneventful until I started getting the texts. They didn't come all at once. The first one I got just said, "You should have kept the red lipstick." No number, just a message from an unknown sender. I figured it was spam or someone trying to be clever. But then a couple days later, another that pizza smelled good last night. Did you save me a slice? That one hit different. I hadn't posted anything online and I live alone. I stared at my phone for a while, trying to remember if maybe I had told someone about the pizza, maybe in passing at work, but no one would say that in such a weird way. I deleted it, told myself not to freak out, and decided to ignore it. People play dumb pranks. Doesn't mean anything. By the time the third message came, "You looked so tired in the kitchen this morning." I stopped pretending it was harmless. My kitchen window faces the back alley. There's an overgrown patch of grass, a dumpster, and a rusted fire escape that leads to the side of the building. I'd kept that window cracked for air since the heat in the building made it feel like a sauna, but I hadn't thought anyone could see in from that angle. I slammed it shut and yanked the blinds down so hard they went crooked. I changed my number the next day, blocked the old one, and tried to convince myself that was the end of it. Things were quiet for about a week after I changed my number. I stopped checking the peephole every few minutes and even cracked the window open again one night because the air inside felt suffocating. I started trying to fall back into some kind of routine. TV before bed, chamomile tea, ignoring the shadows that stretched under the hallway door when someone passed by. Then during a late shift folding clearance jeans, my phone buzzed. A new number, no name. The massage was just one sentence. I liked the blue pajamas better. I remember staring at it, with the kind of numb disbelief you get when your brain can't decide whether to panic or laugh. The blue pajamas were old, faded, and I only wore them once that week inside my apartment, curtains closed. That night, I dragged a heavy dining chair into the bathroom and wedged it under the doorknob. I know how that sounds, but when you feel like someone's watching you, logic doesn't mean much. I ordered blackout curtains online, paid for overnight shipping, and skipped my shift the next day just to be home when they arrived. I hung them up before noon. Then I walked through the entire apartment, checking closets, under the sink, behind, the water heater. I even pulled the mattress away from the wall like I'd find someone crouched behind it waiting. It was ridiculous, but I did it anyway. Eventually, I told myself I had to stop feeding it. No more giving in to the fear. No more checking locks 5 times. No more imagining footsteps. I even said it out loud one night while brushing my teeth, like repeating it would force it to be true. I was staring at myself in the mirror, trying to believe I looked calm, when I noticed something shift behind me. The bathroom window cracked open, just an inch for ventilation, showed a sliver of darkness from the alley behind the building. And in that sliver, something moved just enough to break the shape of the shadows, a head, a shoulder. It was gone before I could even blink, but I backed away so fast I knocked the toothbrush into the sink and nearly tripped over the trash can. I didn't wait. I called the police. Not 911. I didn't want to sound dramatic, but the non-emergency line. I told the woman on the other end that someone had been watching me through my window. I could hear myself trying to sound reasonable, normal, like someone they'd take seriously. She sent 2 officers within 10 minutes. They walked the alley, checked the window, asked me the usual questions. One of them kept saying things like, might have been a raccoon or could have been shadows. But the other guy, older, quiet, asked if I had somewhere I could stay for the night. That was the first time I felt like I wasn't losing my mind. The officers did a full sweep of the building just to be thorough. I stayed outside by the squad car with a blanket over my shoulders, watching their flashlights move across the windows like ghosts pacing inside. It was freezing, but I didn't care. I felt exposed, like whatever had been hiding out there had finally stepped a little too close. 20 minutes later, one of the officers came out with a box, a plain cardboard box, sealed with duct tape. He didn't say much at first, just asked if I recognized any of the items. Inside, a black balaclava gloves, and a roll of duct tape. The gloves looked familiar. Rob had a pair just like that, and I knew that brand of tape. He used it for everything. His initials were written on the inside flap of the box with Sharpie. Road. They found it stashed in the laundry room, the ground floor, tucked behind the water heater in a corner no one used. I hadn't thought of Rob in weeks, not really. After the breakup, he'd texted me a couple of times. Nothing threatening, just vague stuff like, hope you're doing okay, or miss talking to you. I didn't reply. I'd even blocked his number eventually, but he'd been to that building once. He helped me move in. I guess that was enough. He knew which unit was mine, knew how the windows opened, knew I lived alone. The police didn't arrest him that night, but they did track him down for questioning. Apparently, he denied everything. Said he hadn't been near my building since moving day, and that he had no idea how any of that stuff got there. They couldn't prove he'd been trespassing. There were no cameras in the alley, and nothing had technically happened inside my apartment. But after that night, I didn't sleep there again. I packed everything into my car the next morning and went to stay with my sister across town. She didn't ask many questions. I think she saw it in my face. Something had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. A few weeks later, I broke my lease and moved out for good. I haven't heard from him since. I never got another message. I still don't know what he was planning, or how long he'd been watching. But sometimes I think about the box in the laundry room, and how close it was to the stairs that led straight to my floor. I think about how small that gap was in the window, and how easily I'd ignored the feeling that something was wrong, just because I didn't want to sound crazy. I learned to listen to that feeling now. Even if it whispers, something happened to me last year that still gives me chills whenever I think about it. I'm a 37-year-old software engineer living in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Minneapolis. At the time, I was spending most days alone in my 2-story house, since I'd been remote for about 2 years. The place isn't anything fancy, just a typical 1990s build with a small front yard and neighbors close enough that you can hear their dogs barking through the walls. I'd been living there for about 3 years, and honestly, I felt pretty safe. Crime wasn't really a thing in our area, and most of the neighbors were families with kids or older retired folks who kept to themselves. The most exciting thing that usually happened was maybe a package getting delivered to the wrong address, or Mrs. Chen from next door asking me to keep an eye on her mail while she visited her daughter. The whole thing went down on a Tuesday, February 2022, right in the middle of one of those nasty winter storms that Minnesota loves to throw at you. I remember the date because it was the same day I was supposed to have a video call with some clients, but the weather had been getting progressively worse throughout the afternoon. The wind was howling like something out of a horror movie, and I could hear tree branches scraping against the roof every few minutes. I was in my home office, which is basically just a converted bedroom on the 2nd floor, trying to wrap up some coding work before the storm got any worse. The power had been flickering on and off for about an hour, just enough to make me nervous about losing my progress on this project I'd been grinding on for weeks. Around 6:30 p.m., the lights finally gave up completely. 1 second, I was staring at my computer screen, and the next, everything went pitch black. The sudden silence was almost deafening. No more humming from the refrigerator downstairs. No more worrying from my computer fans. Just the storm raging outside and my own breathing. I sat there for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness, and reached for my phone to use the flashlight. The house felt different in the dark, bigger somehow, with all those familiar creaks and settling sounds becoming more pronounced. I made my way downstairs, carefully using my phone's light to navigate the steps, and headed toward the kitchen, where I kept a couple of flashlights in the junk drawer. The whole neighborhood was dark when I peeked out the window, so I figured it was just a widespread outage from the storm. I'd barely gotten the flashlight working when I heard it. 3 solid knocks on my front door. Not the kind of casual knocking you'd expect from a neighbor, but deliberate, authoritative knocks that cut through the sound of the wind. For a second, I thought maybe it was Mrs. Chen checking to see if I was okay, but then I realized she was probably dealing with her own power issues. The knocking came again, more insistent this time, and I could hear a man's voice calling out, though I couldn't make out the words over the storm. I grabbed my phone and the flashlight and headed toward the front door, my bare feet cold against the hardwood floor. Through the peephole, I could see the silhouette of a tall man in what looked like a uniform, holding some kind of clipboard or folder. He was wearing a baseball cap and had on what appeared to be a work jacket with reflective strips on it. "Electric Company," he shouted through the door, his voice muffled, but clear enough. "I need to check your breaker panel. We're getting reports of electrical issues in the area, and I need to make sure everything's safe before we can restore power." The guy sounded professional enough, and honestly, part of me was relieved that someone was already working on getting the lights back on, but something about the timing felt weird. It had only been maybe 15 minutes since the power went out, and here was this guy already at my door. I cracked the door open just enough to talk to him, keeping the chain lock engaged. Up close, I could see he was probably in his 40s, average build, with a scraggly beard, a nose kind of pale, watery eyes that seemed to reflect the light from my flashlight in an unsettling way. His work jacket looked legit. It had patches and Logos that seemed right for a utility worker. But there was something about his demeanor that made me hesitate. "I'm going to need access to your basement," he continued, shifting his weight from foot to foot like he was eager to get inside the main breaker panel. "You know, just a quick check to make sure there's no damage from the storm. Could be dangerous if there's a short or something. He held up what looked like an official work order on a clipboard, though I couldn't really make out the details in the dark and storm. The way he kept glancing past me into the house made me uncomfortable, like he was trying to get a look at the layout or see if anyone else was home. His boots were surprisingly clean for someone who'd supposedly been out working in this weather, and I noticed he didn't have any of the usual utility company gear. No tool belt, no voltage tester, nothing that looked like the equipment I'd seen other electricians carry when they'd worked on my house before. "Listen, I appreciate you coming out in this storm," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "but I'm going to need to call and verify this with the power company first." "You understand, right?" The change in his expression was immediate and unsettling. The friendly professional mask slipped for just a moment, and I caught a glimpse of something darker underneath: irritation, maybe even anger. He recovered quickly, forcing what I can only describe as an overly bright smile, but his eyes stayed cold and calculating. Of course," he said, but there was a tightness in his voice now, though I should mention the phones are probably down because of the storm. "Cell towers, too. You might not be able to get through to anyone tonight." He was wrong about that. My phone had full bars, and I could see the neighbor's house across the street still had their porch light on, which meant their power was fine. I closed the door and immediately turned the deadbolt, my heart starting to race as the reality of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't right. None of this was right. I pulled out my phone and dialed the customer service number for the electric company that I had saved from the last time I'd had to call them about a billing issue. The phone rang twice before it recorded. Message picked up, and I navigated through the menu to report an outage. When I finally got through to a real person, I explained the situation, that I'd lost power and someone claiming to be from their company was at my door. The representative put me on hold for what felt like forever, and I could hear the man outside, moving around, his footsteps crunching in the snow as he walked around the perimeter of my house. When she came back on the line, her words made my stomach clench with fear. "Sir, we show no outages reported in your area tonight, and we definitely don't have any crews dispatched to your neighborhood." The phone call confirmed what my gut had been telling me. This guy was not who he claimed to be. I thanked the representative and hung up, then immediately dialed 911. While I waited for them to answer, I could hear the man outside trying the door handle, the metal rattling softly as he tested whether it was locked. Then came the sound of his footsteps moving toward the back of the house, and I realized he was checking all the possible entry points. The 911 operator answered on the third ring, and I whispered my address and explained that someone was trying to get into my house by impersonating a utility worker. She told me to stay on the line, and that officers were being dispatched. But in a storm like this, response times could be delayed. Meanwhile, I could hear the man moving around my backyard, and at one point, I saw the beam of a flashlight sweep across my kitchen window. He was being methodical, checking every door and window on the ground level. I grabbed a kitchen knife from the block on the counter and made my way upstairs, staying on the phone with the dispatcher. From my bedroom window, I had a better view of the street and could see that several houses in the neighborhood still had power. Their windows were glowing warmly in the darkness. My power hadn't gone out because of the storm. Somehow, this person had cut my electricity specifically. The realization hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't some random opportunist taking advantage of a power outage. This was planned. This was targeted. I could hear him trying the sliding door that led to my back deck, the metal frame squeaking as he applied pressure. The dispatcher kept asking me questions. Could I see any vehicles? Did I recognize the person? Was I somewhere safe? but my mind was racing with possibilities, none of them good. Who was this guy? Why my house? How long had he been watching me to know that I lived alone? The next 20 minutes were the longest of my life. I stayed upstairs, knife in hand, watching from different windows as this person continued to circle my house like a predator. At one point, he disappeared completely, and the silence was almost worse than hearing his footsteps. I kept thinking he'd found a way in, that any second I'd hear him coming up the stairs. Then I spotted him near my neighbor's fence, and I realized he was probably trying to figure out if anyone else was around to help me or witness what he was doing. The storm was working in his favor. It was loud enough to mask any sounds he might make, and most people were probably hunkered down inside their own homes. I could see him checking his phone periodically, and at one point, he made a call to someone, though I couldn't hear what he was saying. The fact that he wasn't working alone made everything 10 times more terrifying. Finally, I heard the most beautiful sound in the world. Sirens in the distance getting closer. The man must have heard them too, because suddenly he was moving fast, jogging away from my house toward the street. From my bedroom window, I watched him climb into a dark pickup truck that had been parked about 3 houses down, its lights off. He drove away without turning on his headlights, disappearing into the storm, just as 2 police cars turned onto my street. When the officers arrived, they found that my main electrical line had been deliberately cut with wire cutters. A clean, professional job that had killed power to just my house. They also discovered fresh footprints around my entire property, and scratches around my back door lock where he'd been trying to force it open. The police filed a report and increased patrols in the area, but they never caught the guy. A week later, I had security cameras installed and changed all my locks. I still don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I'm certain that if I had let him inside that night, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. My Aunt Claire had booked at a hiking retreat in the mountains, the kind of thing where you leave your phone in a locker and meditate with strangers. She needed someone to look after her house while she was gone, mostly just to feed her cat and water the herbs she'd been fussing over. Since I had just left a toxic job and wasn't in any rush to start another one, I figured some quiet time in a different neighborhood might actually help clear my head. The house wasn't far, just on the edge of a quiet older suburb, the kind with lopsided mailboxes and porches cluttered with wind chimes and ceramic frogs. It was the 5th day when I first noticed him. I just finished rinsing a coffee mug when something out the kitchen window caught my eye. A man stood by the back fence, motionless, about 3 feet from the corner where the wood slats bent toward the alley. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there with his arms hanging awkwardly at his sides, like he wasn't sure what to do with them. I couldn't make out his face in the fading light, but he wasn't looking at me. At least I didn't think so. I assumed it was a neighbor, maybe someone taking a shortcut or just zoning out for a moment. Still, I waited for him to move. He didn't. The next evening, just after sunset, I saw him again. Same spot, same pasture. That time, I turned on the porch light and stepped out with the excuse of checking the herb pots, just to get a better look. The second the screen door clicked shut behind me, he turned around and walked off down the alley. Not fast, not slow, calm, like he knew I was watching and didn't care. I went back inside with a weird tightness behind my ribs. Something I told myself was just me overthinking. He hadn't done anything. He hadn't even crossed the fence. The thing is, I didn't say anything to anyone, not even my boyfriend. When we FaceTimed later, I didn't want to sound paranoid, but on the 7th night, the power blinked off for about 10 seconds during dinner, just enough to be annoying. When the lights came back, the cat was no longer on the window sill where he'd been curled up. I found him hiding behind the laundry machine, pupils wide, tail puffed. I laughed it off, telling him he was being dramatic, but as I walked back into the living room, I noticed the sliding back door, which I always kept locked, was slightly open, just to in. No breeze, no creak, just that quiet, deliberate gap. I stood there staring at the door, trying to convince myself I'd left it like that, but I couldn't remember doing it. I always checked the locks before bed, a habit from growing up with a mom who triple-checked every window before turning in, slid it shut, locked it, and walked the perimeter of the house. Twice, every door, every window locked. Still, I didn't sleep much that night. Every faint creak of the walls settling made me sit up. At one point, I thought he heard footsteps on the gravel outside, but when I peeked through the blinds, the yard was empty. The next morning, something felt rearranged. Not dramatically, just a few small things. A coffee spoon left in the sink that I was sure I hadn't used. One of my socks missing from the laundry basket. The cat's bowl shifted a foot to the left. All of it was subtle enough to make me question myself. Or at least that's what I kept telling myself. I even made a little joke about it in a voice note to my friend Emily. Maybe Claire's house is just haunted by a really tidy ghost. I didn't mention the man at the fence or the sliding door. Later that day, I decided to go outside and really look around the backyard. Claire's fence stretched all the way around, tall and weathered, but still sturdy. The area near the alley had some overgrown vines and an old rake leaning against it. I walked along the fence line and noticed something odd. A worn patch in the grass, like someone had been standing in the same spot over and over. The dirt was packed down, and there were scuff marks on the bottom slats of the wood. The fence wasn't broken or bent, but the boards had tiny scratch marks along the edge, not clawed, not natural, like fingernails or something close. That night, he didn't show up. I kept waiting, lights off, crouched by the kitchen window like a kid spying on a sleepover. Nothing. I almost felt disappointed until I walked past the whole closet and noticed it was cracked open. I hadn't touched that closet. Claire told me I didn't need to use it. It was just old coats and boxes of Christmas decorations. I pushed the door open slowly. The chain from one of the coats was swinging slightly, like it had been moved just a few seconds earlier. The air inside smelled faintly of sweat and something else I couldn't place. Stale like fabric that had been shut away too long. But what unsettled me most was the small piece of gravel sitting on the hardwood floor just inside the threshold. The same kind of gravel that lined the alley behind the house. That night, I didn't turn out the lights. I wanted him to know I was awake. Or maybe I just wanted to believe the brightness would keep him away. I slept on the couch with the cat curled up by my legs, both of us tense at every sound. Around 3 a.m., I heard the smallest noise, like the soft click of a door settling back into its frame. I didn't move. I barely even breathed. I just stared at the hallway and waited. Nothing followed. No footsteps, no voices, just silence. So heavy, it felt like the house was holding its breath with me. The next morning, I found more gravel, this time in the bathroom and the edge of the sink. That made no sense. I hadn't opened the window, and the window didn't even have a screen that could be removed. Something else was gone, too. My keys, the full set. They weren't in the bowl near the front door where I always left them. I tore the house apart looking. Every drawer, under every cushion. Nothing. That's when I really started to panic. Not the cold kind of fear from seeing something weird in the yard. The real kind. The kind that gets under your skin and settles in your spine. Someone had been inside. Someone had taken something. I left that afternoon, packed a bag, locked every door behind me, and drove straight to a friend's place across town. I didn't even leave a note for Claire. I texted her later and said there had been a plumbing issue, and I had to cut the house sitting short. I couldn't bring myself to explain what really happened. The truth felt too strange, too fragile. A man, outside every night, but never crossing the fence. Then things missing, moved, wrong, and gravel. Just gravel turning up in places it shouldn't be. No signs of forced entry, no damage, no answers. When Claire got back, she told me everything looked fine. She even found my keys in the hall closet, she said, tucked inside one of her winter boots. I didn't know what to say. I never told her about the man or the gravel, but I haven't been back to that house since. Sometimes I wonder if he still stands by that fence every evening, just far enough not to be a crime, close enough to be noticed, watching, waiting for someone else who won't take him seriously until he's no longer standing outside. It was one of those late afternoons when everything felt just slightly out of rhythm. Not wrong, just unsettled. I'd spent most of the day working from my apartment, editing a set of product mock-ups for a coffee brand in Vermont. Freelance design pays the bills, barely, and I was trying to declutter and make a bit of extra cash. I had this old Lenovo laptop, maybe 4 years outdated, but still functional, collecting dust in my closet. I posted it on Craigslist with a few pictures, and within an hour, a guy named Mark responded, said he was nearby. Polite tone, no weird typos or haggle tactics. We agreed he'd swing by around 7 o'clock p.m. I live in a one-bedroom place on the bottom floor of a triplex in a small suburb just outside Albany. Quiet neighborhood. My apartment faces the street and there's a side alley that wraps around to the back. Since it was already getting dark, and I didn't feel like driving to meet him somewhere sketchy, I figured letting him stop by would be easier. Dumb, I know, but it felt normal at the time. I even texted my friend Alex, just to casually mention someone was coming by, more out of habit than concern. Mark showed up exactly at 7:03. I remember that because I glanced at the microwave clock when he knocked. He looked average, mid-30s, dark jeans, grey hoodie, clean-shaven. He smiled when I opened the door, but not in a weird way, more like someone doing a favor. I invited him in, showed him the laptop, even offered to plug it in so he could check. If everything worked, he nodded along, asked a few questions, then kind of abruptly asked if he could use the bathroom. I hesitated for a second, but it felt too awkward to say no. It's just a bathroom, right? The moment he disappeared down the hall, something shifted. I couldn't explain why, but the quiet got heavier. I stood near the kitchen listening. After maybe a minute, I heard the toilet flush, the sink run, and then nothing, just silence. A long, bloated silence. Then all at once, the lights went out. Every bulb. The microwave clock, too. The hum of the fridge cut off. At first, I thought the breaker tripped, but when I turned toward the front door, I saw it was wide open. No Mark, no laptop, just the night air leaking in through the doorway, and the sound of distant traffic like that nothing had ever happened. I stepped outside, still holding my phone, thinking maybe he'd stepped out for a call or something, but the sidewalk was empty. No cars pulling away, no footsteps fading, just that eerie stillness neighborhoods get after dinner when everyone's already settled in for the night. I walked back in and locked the door, more annoyed than scared. I figured he'd pulled some kind of distraction trick to grab the laptop and run. Classic bait and switch. But when I checked the table, the laptop charger was still plugged into the wall and the power wasn't out on the whole street. My neighbor's porch lights were glowing like nothing happened. It was just my place. I went to the circuit breaker in the hallway closet and flipped it back on. Everything hummed to life again. Fridge, lights, microwave. I locked every door and window after that. Double-checked the bathroom, too, just in case. Nothing. No one. I texted Alex something like, "Guy came by kind of weird. Stole the laptop maybe. Not sure." I didn't feel like explaining all the details yet. I sat on the couch with my phone in my hand, thinking maybe I just overreacted. Maybe he panicked. Maybe it was all just some flaky Craigslist dude being flaky. But that night didn't settle. Around 10:40, I heard a noise from the kitchen. Not loud. A small distinct click like a cabinet gently shutting. My cat was at my parents' for the week, so it wasn't that. I stood up and walked over, flicking on the kitchen light. Nothing seemed out of place. I opened a few drawers just to be sure. Even the fridge, Still nothing. I told myself, maybe the wood shifted or something. You know how apartments make random noises when they settle? Still, I ended up turning every light on in the apartment just to feel less stupidly exposed. Little after midnight, I tried to sleep. I locked the bedroom door again, something I don't normally do, and left a lamp on. But just as I was drifting, I heard the front door rattle. Like someone gently tested the knob, maybe once or twice, then stopped. I lay there staring at the ceiling, trying not to breathe too loud. I didn't move, didn't check. I just waited, counting out seconds in my head until I lost track. Eventually, it went quiet again. I told myself it had to be wind or a delivery person hitting the wrong house, but my body didn't believe me. The next morning, sunlight didn't make the place feel any better. I noticed something off right away. The door to the hallway closet was slightly ajar. I was sure I'd closed it after flipping the breaker. I opened it slowly and everything looked normal at first. Broom, vacuum, storage bins, but wedged between two boxes on the floor was an empty coffee cup. Not mine, not a brand I drink. I stared at it for a long time before picking it up with a paper towel and tossing it. That little detail hit harder than the open door or the blackout dart it meant he'd been comfortable enough to bring something in, set it down like he planned to stay. I went back through the apartment methodically, checking the windows, inside the pantry, behind the shower curtain, even under the bed. I didn't find him, but I found other things. In the hallway near the bathroom, the rug had been moved slightly, revealing a phone charger I didn't own. My toothbrush had been placed back in its holder upside down. Small things, but intentional, subtle enough to make me second guess if I was imagining it. And that's when it really hit me. He hadn't run off. He never left. That day, I worked from a cave down the road. I didn't go back home until it was nearly dark again. Not because I felt brave, but because I didn't know what else to do. When I got back, the place was just how I left it. No signs of entry. But I couldn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about how the breaker's in a spot you'd only find if you were looking for it, or if you'd seen the layout in advance. I started thinking maybe that Guy Mark, or whatever his real name was, had done this before. Maybe it wasn't about the laptop. Maybe it never was. I moved out 2 weeks later, took a sublet across town with a roommate I didn't know that well, just to not be alone. I changed my number. Stopped using Craigslist completely. I never saw him again, never heard anything more. But even now, I can't walk into a dark room without wondering if someone's already there, standing perfectly still, waiting.